Okay.
Right, good morning all. Matt Phillips here, Head of Law and Monitoring Officer. Welcome to the Standards Committee for the Monday the 22nd of March 2021. Obviously, since we last met, our chair or former chair, Trevor Auld, has completed his allotted time with the committee. So just to start things off, on behalf of Monmouthshire County Council and I'm sure the committee as well, just wanted to express our thanks to Trevor for all of his service. What that means is that's why you have me talking to start with rather than a chair, because the first duty that we need to perform today is to an elected chair. So whereas previously it was Trevor as chair and Richard Stowe was the vice chair, we will now need to go through the process of nominating again. So does any member have a nomination for chair of the committee, please?
Yes, Matt. I'd like to nominate Richard.
I'll second that.
That's seconded. And are there, does anyone have any alternative proposal or dissent to that proposal?
No.
Okay, that's silent. So therefore, Richard Stowe has been elected the chair of the Standards Committee for Monmouthshire County Council. I'm conscious Richard's camera isn't working today, but he is with us. He can hear and be heard, which is the key parts for any of these remote meetings. So, Chair, if you're happy, I will hand over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Matt. And I do apologise for the technical hitch at my end. I did download the Microsoft Teams app for Macintosh, which is what I'm running on here, and it's telling me it can't see the camera, but the camera's still there, so I'm stuck, I'm afraid. Could you just explain again, I didn't really get what is the process for the vice chair appointment, please?
So I think very simply, it would be an invitation of the committee members today. And actually, I've been remiss in not explaining that to the quorum of any standards committee requires that at least half of the members present are independent members. And while we haven't come into apologies yet, obviously, I've already mentioned that we have one member who is no longer part of the committee because of time served. We've also had apologies from another member, Richard McGonigal, which means we have 3 independent members with us today. That means that for us to be at quorum, it needs to be a maximum of 3 non-independent members. So representing the council and community councils, we have Councillor Clark, Councillor Evans and Councillor Cameron. And Councillor Woodhouse, who would normally be a member of the committee, is attending in a non-voting capacity. And therefore, will contribute as the chair would allow any other visiting member to attend, but as not as a voting member today. So we are at quorum. So the process, Chair, would be to ask of the committee if there are nominations for the position of vice chair, and that can be a discussion as you so choose to come to a nomination. Then to seek for someone to second that nomination, and then we'll be looking to see if there are any other nominations or any dissent to that proposal.
Okay, thank you. So first of all, then I'll ask for, are there any nominations for vice chair?
I'd like to nominate Eileen.
And is there?
I'll second that.
Seconded. And are there any other nominations? And is there any dissent to that proposal?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, I'm just calling up the legislation to make sure I get this right, but I think the chair may always have to come from the independent members. So apologies for not making that clear. So I'm just checking the legislation now. So I'm looking at section 22 of the relevant regulations at the moment, and apologies for not doing this beforehand. So it's saying the period for the positions is the same as that for an independent member. So looking at section 22 subsection 1, Members of a standing committee shall elect a chair and a vice chair from amongst the independent members. Apologies, I should have made that clear from the outset. That's why it was Trevor and Richard previously. So apologies, Irene.
Okay.
So effectively, Chair, we're asking for a nomination from either Richard McGonigal, who's not with us today, though that wouldn't prevent his name being put forward, or Peter Easy or Rhian Williams-Flew.
Well, in that case, in his absence, I will nominate Richard McGonigal, who joined the committee on the same day as me in January 2017, and I hope he's okay with that.
I'd second that.
Happy with that, Chairman.
Yeah.
Thank you. And is there any other nominations? No. And any dissent?
No.
No. So I think Richard is therefore appointed as vice chair. Are you okay with that, Matt?
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. And if that causes Richard a problem at all, it is always possible to resign the position, and we can revisit this. But I imagine he'll be delighted.
Yeah, thank you. So next item, apologies for absence, which I believe is just Richard, I think.
That's correct, Chair.
Yep. Declarations of interest.
As a main chair.
Yep. And then on to number 5, the appointment process for the new independent member to replace Trevor. Matt, do you want to start on that, please?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Okay, so we've actually taken a little bit of a trip around the relevant legislation this morning already, just to get the formalities done. But just as a refresher, standards committees are obviously required for local authorities. The constitution of a standards committee can be anywhere between 5 and 9 members. And as I explained before, for a meeting to be, so you have to have the chair and vice chair filled by independent members. And for any meeting to be quorum, then at least 50% of the attendees need to be independent members as well. Hence the reason that there's such importance given to the selection and then placement of independent members. So with Trevor Auld, because the positions are have a period of tenure, and then they can be extended once, but then go no further. So Trevor Auld had completed that extended period. We now have a standards committee of 8 members, 4 of whom are independent members, 3 of whom represent the county council, and 1 of whom represents community councils. So we are perfectly legally quorate in general, and any meeting at which everyone attends, we would be quorate as well. So there is no issue, there is no legal issue that we are looking to deal with here. To remind you of the process, if you did want to go down the route of seeking to get another independent member to join us, and I believe the general makeup of the standards committee within Monmouthshire County Council has been 9 for a significant period of time, albeit that has dropped down. It was certainly at 7 when I first joined because of the recent departure of 2 independent members. But if we were to go through an appointment process, that would require us to advertise in 2 relevant local newspapers, plus of course we would advertise on our website and by other means, so that people are aware that the positions are open. Invite applications in a format to be determined by us, to be perfectly honest. We then need to constitute a panel of 5 members for the appointment panel. One of those members needs to be a lay person, so i.e. someone who does not sit on the current standards committee. And then we would go through it, like with any recruitment process. Effectively, if there were sufficient applications, we'd go through an initial assessment, and then sifting down to a final group of attendees. And then it would be what we've done in the past is a face-to-face interview with those 5 members, generally I think the last couple of iterations have been chaired by the lay person. So I think that is the process set out, unless anyone has any questions or points on the process that we followed in the past.
The last time it worked very well.
So the question then, Chair, is does the committee wish to go through that process? You are at 8 members and you are quorate in your inherent setup, so there's no requirement to go through that process. And then, of course, if there was a desire to go through that process, we would need to consider the fact that it would not be able to run in the way that we ran it previously because of the current COVID restrictions. So I suppose the 3 options would be to go through a process in a COVID appropriate way, to not go through a process for the time being and review it at some point in the future, or to make a commitment to increasing the standards committee back to 9 again, but defer the commencement of the application process until some point in the future where that face-to-face interview process could be held. There may be other options. Those are just the ones that spring to mind for me at the moment.
My thinking about it, my preference would be, number 1, definitely not to start a recruitment process now under COVID corona restrictions, and it would be to leave the possibility of starting the process, let's say early summer, assuming that we're by then free of restrictions, so that someone could be available for the next meeting on the 18th of October, and then winding back, which would need full council approval at the nearest full council to that date. So I think I'd be thinking that at the moment we say we haven't made a decision, but perhaps, Matt, we could revisit this on the assumption that corona restrictions and the whole public health situation is significantly improved by July, say, that then, given we've done the process before, we've got a lot of the materials and things, that we could start that with the aim of having someone on board for the 18th of October. And I'd be interested in other members' views on that.
Yeah, certainly I agree with that, Richard, and because it worked so well last time, I think we ought to follow what we did last time if possible. It's very difficult doing online interviews. I'm doing some interviews this week and it's been very difficult getting the people into the school to sort of see the school and us from our homes interviewing them. So if we could defer it and revisit it, I think that would be the best one.
Well, I'm happy with that. Yeah.
Can I just
Yes,
say
I'm
I
happy with
totally
that.
agree with that.
Yeah, please go ahead, Sheila.
Sorry, I totally agree with deferring it
Yeah.
and revisiting it in the future.
Great. So Matt, can we agree that we defer it, and perhaps at a point in whenever you think would be, June or July, we could make a decision via email communication whether we go ahead or not, or whether we still defer it depending on the public health situation.
Yeah, Chair, very, very happy with that. For the sake of the minutes, and so there's something definitive, should we say that action is with me to communicate with the members of the Standard Committee no later than the 7th of June?
Yeah.
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 And then that will be a decision point then as part of that communication as to whether to go ahead with the recruitment process with those October dates in mind, as you said.
Yes, exactly. And Irene's exactly correct that we want to do a face-to-face process and not anything online, etc. Good. I think that's a decision on that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the next item is the the feedback on the code of conduct training for Mathern and Shire Newton community councils. Do you want to start with that, Matt? And then I think Irene had some views on that as well.
True.
If you're happy, Chair, and if Irene's happy, I think that Irene asked for this item to go in, and so I think it's probably sensible to hear from Irene first.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right, thank you. It was last January, it seems a long time ago. I joined the meeting as an observer, and it was a very well attended meeting with a friendly atmosphere. And Matt's presentation was also in a very friendly tone. He delivered a comprehensive review of the responsibilities of someone accepting a position as a councillor. He reminded everyone they'd been elected or co-opted onto a committee, a community council or a town council, and they are required to have read and understood they were making decisions on behalf of the community they represent, and there is a moral and legal duty to comply with the code of conduct. Now, Matt went into detail on some of that, but I'll just say that he touched on the importance of the Nolan principles and highlighted other duties, emphasising that we treat people with respect, avoid bullying, and that we should have an awareness of the implications of freedom of speech. Advised on how to avoid acting in our capacity as a councillor, highlighting personal interests or anything that could influence decision making. We were reminded to conduct ourselves in the interests of others and declaring an interest where it was appropriate. He explained how to apply for dispensation if they wanted to speak, and then explained his position within the authority and the Public Service Ombudsman for Wales. And although they seemed to know what Matt was talking about, they were sort of nodding and making approval, it certainly gave an opportunity to remind everyone present what their duties and responsibilities were. I thought it was a first-class presentation, Matt, and it was well received and appreciated. The outcome was that we highlighted the need to refresh and remind all councillors of their responsibilities, why they were elected, and to continue to be kept up to date with developments. Very good meeting, well led by Matt. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Irene. Anyone have any questions to Irene about the training? Peter.
Can I ask Eileen if there were county councillors as well as community councillors at that meeting?
Well, again, it was virtual, so
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure which were the county councillors or which were the community councillors, but everyone was very respectful and very attentive.
Thank you. Thank you.
Any other questions for Irene?
If I could follow on with some of the details that you've sent us, Matt, on developments and highlighting training, especially with community councils, I think that you're a step ahead of some of the things that are happening, because we go on where this committee actually will be responsible for ensuring there's training taking place and that people are up to date with any developments. And apparently we may well have to do an annual report on community council training in the future as a committee.
Thank you, Irene. I have a question then. Was the training session recorded so that councillors who weren't there can go and view it afterwards, or we can go back and look at it? Is it somewhere out in there in the cloud that I can find on the Monmouthshire channel, or could that be done?
Chair, if I may, so to answer one of the questions that was just asked, I don't think there were any county councillors present at this training. And just to explain the nature of this training, it's not mandated. It's not something that has any rigid timetable that the 33, I think it is, community councils of Monmouthshire or across Wales have to go through. It is an option, I think, as to whether a monitoring officer would offer to deliver the training, because of course community councils have access to resourcing and training and documents and what have you through One Voice Wales and the Society for Local Council Clerks and National Association of Local Clerks, or NALC, what I forget what the acronym stands for. Apologies. So this is something that's done on an ad hoc basis, really. All the clerks across Monmouthshire know that I'm happy to give up a couple of hours to do this of an evening, and often the request will come forward where a community council's had a couple of councillors change over, perhaps new co-optees. In fact, Joe, one of my deputy monitoring officers, is going to be having a one-to-one conversation with a new councillor in one of our community councils in the near future. So there's no rigidity to this. It's hosted by the community council. It's not a Monmouthshire County Council kind of hosted event. So there's, whether it is recorded or not is entirely up to the community council. I don't believe this one was. In fact, I don't think I've done one where it has been recorded. So it's very much their meeting for them to kind of take from it what they will. And all I do is I try and set out the interaction of the county council and the community council, the fact that community councils are sovereign bodies. There's not a hierarchical relationship that exists between a county council and a community council, apart from actually the relationship that the standards committee and the monitoring officer has. Because if there was an investigation of a community councillor that the ombudsman then referred back to the standards committee, that's the only time really that you could describe any sort of hierarchical relationship. So I kind of stress how the interaction should work, that my interest is purely code of conduct, but I will generally try and help out on matters of standing orders as well, because that can often help community councils to kind of not go down some blind alleys and end up in potential code of conduct kind of spaces. And yeah, it's an ad hoc arrangement as and when people wish to kind of call upon us for a bit of an update and a refresh. I imagine after the next round of elections, business will get busier, because it's quite a useful resource to tap into then, to just make sure that people get off on the right foot.
Thank you. I can see Sheila has a hand up.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Just a suggestion, really, going forward, as you just touched on, Matt, to the new councils, the next term. It's a very busy period. You get a lot of new members on community and on county councils. I'm just thinking that a couple of options here in the lead up possibly to the next elections. We've got over 12 months. An offer to train the clerks in readiness to train their new councillors and remind existing councillors on these things. And when when I was newly elected here, we had the training taking place, conducted by the monitoring officer and colleagues. Would it be possibly an opportunity to invite, you couldn't invite all the new councillors, I appreciate that from the communities, but possibly, again, any clerk who wished to sit in, so they could actually conduct their own training? Just a suggestion.
Yes, I think that would fit with your doing the conference for the clerks, and actually it's in all our interest that we really help the clerks get up to speed and feel confident with the code and the procedures around it and how they should relate to you and your deputies, isn't it? Because that spreads the expertise around, and it should mean that no one then slips through the net on training and misses out, or we have a council where people haven't been trained for months or even years.
Yeah, Chair, if I may, all good suggestions. And I think if there's one thing that COVID has shown us is that the technological ability to hold either remote or hybrid meetings means that that expanding the reach of what I would naturally be doing within the county council, as Councillor Woodhouse said, after the elections in May 2022, can be kind of multiplied across all the community councils. There's always the balance I need to walk between respecting that none of this is mandatory. The only thing that is mandatory is that councillors sign within a couple of days of election to say that they understand and will adhere to the code of conduct. So that bit's important, but we can't mandate training, although of course generally the take-up is quite good because they're keen to have the training. And then it's balancing against what is offered by some of those other organisations that they may pay a fee to. So I exist in the space exactly as described, which is making the offer, taking advantage of the technology we've got to broaden that offer as wide as possible, and then hopefully allowing people to come forward and take up that opportunity. And the other thing that has changed in the last year or so is we've got Joe Chase and Ben Davis from within the legal team, who are the two deputy monitoring officers of the organisation, who have also joined me in some of the code of conduct training that's been delivered. And so I'm just growing the team from within Monmouthshire County Council, so that will benefit that training. But of course, one of the other things is, if we ever get an investigation passed to the Standards Committee to hear, the chances are I will have been involved in it at some point, because someone often will come to me for advice first. That then turns me into a witness, which means that I wouldn't at that point be able to provide legal advice to you as a Standards Committee. So that's another good reason why Joe and Ben are here listening in today and trying to kind of ease them into the monitoring officer world as well.
I think I've read some of the possible changes in the pipeline are that the Standards Committee will be charged with monitoring performance, advising training as necessary, and present an annual report raising awareness and reporting priorities. So I think Standards Committee itself will be more involved with training in the future.
Yes, that's right, and some of that will come under the next session, because it comes in the two clauses that directly reference standards committees in the local government bill, now the Local Government Act,
Yep.
The next item, so perfectly. Thank you very much, Irene, for that feedback on the training. That's very, very interesting, and it does for me that point about constantly refreshing and reminding all councillors, particularly town and community councillors, of their responsibilities and the code, and using technology to do that is very important. And actually, we'll come back to that point when we get to the APW case tribunal of Councillor Baguli, because that was a huge issue there, although not taken forward by APW. I'll come on to that when that item's there.
Okay. Yeah.
The next item is the Local Government and Election Act. And Matt, if you could introduce that and explain particularly what it means for us and what are the key changes for MCC as a whole, as an authority.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, so I've sent the report out with the agenda that is a kind of a live document, because this is one of those pieces of work which will update and evolve certainly over the next 18 months. So the Local Government and Elections Act received royal assent in January, and in kind of local government terms, it's one of the biggest pieces of legislative change that we've been through in a number of years. It's one of those pieces of legislation that comes along every maybe 5 years. It's also very, very wide ranging, everything from how petitions are presented at council, who is allowed to vote in local government elections, residency, how an officer who works within a local authority might be allowed to stand for an election, through to some really big picture kind of stuff, like the general power of competence, for example, is one of those changes in the law that it came in in England. It was brought in by the Localism Act 2011 and became effective in 2012. And this is a change in the law that basically changes. So the way local authorities have always worked is that you need express provision within a piece of legislation to be allowed to do something. And what the general power of competence, GPOC, does is it flips that approach, so that basically if a normal legal individual is allowed to do something, then so is a council, unless there is a piece of legislation that says that they can't. So it just flips them, moving from a restricted position where something has to be specifically set down to a permissive environment. As big a change in the law as that sounds, actually the practice that we've seen in England over the last 9 years has gone to show that actually that there's so much other legislation that it's not as kind of epoch defining and groundbreaking as it might seem. But I talked to that bit just to try and convey quite what a large ranging piece of legislation this is, that changes how we do our own kind of performance assessment. It changes certain roles like the chief executive. It's large. So within it, as we touched on in the last conversation, there are elements specific to the Standards Committee. I imagine members of the committee will have gone to the elements around the section 62-63 that changes some of the Standards Committee roles, but I'm actually going to start with the element that speaks to the introduction of combined joint committees, or CJCs. So CJCs are one of the pieces in this legislation which have come into force already, and the regulations are being consulted on, and we expect to see them come out, which will provide the detail in the next month, I would expect. CJCs are basically allowing for local authorities to come together and create a CJC in order to, deliver certain functions in a wider geographic pattern than is capable from within just an individual local authority. The legislation effectively splits Wales into 4 principal areas, I think it is. South East Wales is the area that we would be a part of, alongside the 9 other local authorities in that southeastern corner. For South East Wales, we already have the Cardiff Capital Region, which I'm sure members are familiar with, but that being the kind of economic investment collection of the local authorities coming together, represented in the CCR by the leader. Effectively, what the CJC will do, it will, I think, this isn't definitive, but it will see the CCR evolve into a combined joint committee. That evolution will allow them to directly employ people. They will require a code of conduct, which is very likely to be the code of conduct that everyone else is working from at the moment. And therefore, there will also be the need for standards committees to be involved in their work in some way. The representation, it's one local authority, one vote. So the leader would be the representative of Monmouthshire County Council within the CJC, and would effectively exercise a vote on behalf of MCC, delegated powers by the council. No need to go back to council or cabinet for ratification of those decisions. But the CJC can also co-opt members, and that could be a particular expert in a field of business, for example, and equally they can be given voting powers too. So it's useful to know that stuff, but why does the Standards Committee need to know? Because the slight gap, and the thing that we're working on at the moment, is while the leaders will be covered by the code of conduct of the authority that they come from, and therefore if our leader as the representative within that organisation was to commit a breach of the code of conduct, even though he's acting in the capacity of the CCR, it would still go to the Ombudsman, and then ultimately it could fall to the Standards Committee to enforce. The gap at the moment is we don't quite know how it's going to work for co-opted members. So if the 10 leaders around the table decide that they need another 3 members of a committee. It might be to do with economic well-being as one of the key focuses. Clearly, they would have decision-making powers in a democratically constituted construct, but they would have to apply the Nolan principles, as you'd expect of anyone in public office. But at the moment, it's not quite been balanced out how the code of conduct will apply to them because of the way the legislation is written, and therefore which standard committee would deal with it. So I'm just raising that point so you know that there is other stuff that doesn't specifically speak to standards committee within this legislation that could potentially affect you, but also that there's some bits and pieces that need working out that could see standards committees working together. It could see representatives of different standards committee pulled into another. But I think the answer will be whatever is the simplest and the least time and resource impacting. But there is still a little bit of an unknown. So that's the CJC element. I'll pause there in case anyone's got any questions before we come on to the more applicable elements. Okay, so when we get into part 4 of the legislation, this part is it kind of meanders around the general workings of local authorities, refers to job sharing and chief executive roles and how the cabinet should work. In fact, just so you're aware, a lot of the stuff around job sharing and assistance to the executive are aimed at trying to promote a greater inclusivity and diversity within how councils operate, just trying to recognise that it can be hard to get involved in a council because of pre-existing work or family commitments. So that's what it's trying to get to there. It's changed all of the family absence permissions so that it falls in line with an industry standard because it was capped at 26 weeks before. But then what it does is it introduces this legal requirement on leaders of groups within authorities to take reasonable steps to promote good conduct and to cooperate with the standards committee. So that comes into effect in May of next year. I imagine what's happening with this legislation is you've got the legislation which has received royal assent. We've had 2 commencement orders come in already, and there'll be a number coming out which will then set out exactly when each article of the legislation will start. So the indication at the moment is this one and the next bit that I'll talk about will happen in May of next year. And then there'll probably, depending on the complexity of what's been brought in, be some sort of consultation to develop regulations around those pieces of legislation. So you get secondary legislation as well. I don't know how much detail is going to be added to the elements in part 4, but as you can see, you've got the responsibility of the leader to promote good conduct. I don't know whether there'll be additional regulations which will give us more detail on what that looks like. And as Iwan was mentioning, standards committees charged with monitoring performance and advising training as necessarily. Again, if that's left as it is, that will create a legal duty, but it will fall to each standards committee and indeed the council to decide how they want that to be articulated. I don't have any additional detail as yet. And then the one which is a little bit more of a straightforward legal requirement is the requirement on the standards committee to make an annual report to council on all of those other elements and their general functions. There's been some tweaks. Well, we know about the changes to the ombudsman's powers that have happened recently. And then there are the community council training elements are more a matter for the community councils, is where it places the duty and the responsibility really, rather than with the local authority, the monitoring officer, or the standards committee as I read it. But again, that doesn't come in until May next year. I don't have any additional detail at the moment. So that's my understanding of it at the moment, but I imagine members will have had a look themselves.
Thank you, Matt. Does anyone have any questions or comments on the Act and its implications for us, for the Standards Committee? Matt, do you want to say something?
Sorry, I neglected to say, my feeling is that in terms of how this is going to happen, it's the kind of topic that's likely to be kind of front and centre in the standards conference when we get to it in October. So at the moment we can see the bare bones as they're set out, but it wouldn't surprise me if around October time we're starting to get into more detail, or maybe the consultation and discussion. And then for our March meeting next year, we'll probably have all of the detail required to then know exactly what it is that the Standards Committee is going to be required to do going forward.
Thank you. I just have something I spotted in the information you sent us was that, I think this is true now, in Wales, audit committees are going to become governance and audit committees. So they're going to see a broadening of their functions. And also there's going to be a third of the members are going to be laypersons. I know in Monmouthshire, the chair is a layperson on audit. Is that correct? But that's quite a change. Do you want to say something briefly about that, about where that's coming from? And
yeah, that is right. That is the change, and that is the current setup within Monmouthshire, that we the chair of audit is an independent member. In terms of what's driven that, I honestly don't have sufficient detail to speak to it. I think in terms of the change from audit to audit and governance, first of all, actually, it reflects how our audit committee operates in Monmouthshire already. And if you think about previous conversations we've had about where should whistleblowing and complaints and what have you be reported to, because there was a bit of dual reporting, we were never sure. And we made the decision, actually, I could draw the link to the audit committee through legislation better than to the standards committee, which of course is to do with councillor behaviour. And really what this legislation is doing is reflecting some of the changes we've made already. So I think the key change for Monmouthshire will be that lay member element. It's also, it kind of aligns the idea of putting the word governance in there. And this is purely my conjecture. This is not taken from Welsh Government in any way. But there's always quite an emphasis put on in governance circles what is called the golden triangle. So if I've not mentioned this before, the golden triangle is the three people within any local authority who are basically charged by statute for the overall governance, or you might use the word compliance depending on your kind of industry background, but basically the kind of ethical and legal construct of how an organisation works. And that's the chief executive, the Section 151 officer, who has, is charged by legislation for the correct financial activity of an organisation, and also has the ability, has the duty to make a report if any action is taken which steps outside the budget, or if a budget setting is not possible. So good examples of that recently would be some of the coverage you would have seen of Northamptonshire and some of the Robin Hood energy investment decisions that were made there. And I'm going to have to be careful now. I'm going to confuse two councils, so I'm not going to name them. There has been another one where there's been what's called a Section 114 report brought recently because of financial issues, both in England, and both cases, I believe, where the Ministry for Housing, Local Government and Communities have stepped in to a certain degree to assist the councils to get themselves sorted. And then the third member of that golden triangle is the monitoring officer, so what Section 151 officer does from a finance and audit, kind of true audit point of view. The monitoring officer is there from the legal and ethical point of view. So I kind of see the golden triangle as it exists within offices is being replicated to a degree in just making a bit clearer what it is that audit does beyond the pure finance, which is into that governance area as well.
Thank you, Matt. And actually, you mentioned something there about the whistleblowing and the services complaints. I believe that the revised constitution went through unamended at the last full council. I think it was on the 11th. And am I correct in saying that the only change to the Standards Committee role and functions in the constitution was the removal of those two elements, that services complaints is dropped off us and goes essentially to audit, and the same with whistleblowing. Is that correct?
I believe so. I mean, I know because those were decisions made at a previous standards committee, or there was certainly a discussion that we had. And I believe that's correct, but it's a 280-page document, the Constitution. But I don't, there was nothing, had there been any other changes to the standards committee, I would have been, clearly it would have required consultation with your good self. So I think that's right.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. We'll move on then to the next item, which is the adjudication panel for Wales decision report on Councillor Baguli, Phil Baguli of Sully and Lavernock Community Council, which is in the Vale of Glamorgan. And I asked for this to go on the agenda because I thought it was a very good example, really, of how the Ombudsman and APW will deal with code breaches involving social media. You know, it's a very clear-cut case, and it does show you that social media posts like the ones here can end up with you being disqualified, and with publicity in the national media such as Wales Online, Western Mail. So the APW thought that the posts, which you'll have seen, were threatening in nature and promoted violence towards individuals, so they weren't protected under Article 10 of the European Convention as political expression. And the decision report sets out the decision-making process very clearly, I thought. First of all, about how Article 10 was applied to the allegations, and secondly, how they came up with the sanction and referencing their own sanctions guidance and things that were mitigating factors and things that were aggravating factors. So overall, the panel said 15 months disqualification was a justified breach of Councillor Baguli's Article 10 rights. I noticed three issues of interest here. Number one, very important for councillors to understand, it's the authority's code of conduct that counts, not the policy or policies of the social media provider. Because part of the argument back by Councillor Baguli or his representatives was that, well, Facebook didn't take my posts down, you know, they weren't objected to, and therefore they were okay. And that wasn't correct reasoning, and APW said, no, we measure against the code, and it's not to do with the community standards policies of Facebook. The second thing that struck me, and this relates exactly to what Irene said earlier about our responsibility for, you know, constantly making sure that we are training councillors, particularly new councillors. The decision report says Councillor Baguli did not attend any training on code of conduct or social media during his period in office, which I think that's shocking. And it doesn't say whether opportunities were offered and he failed to take them or declined. It doesn't explain it. And I have a question for later, whether we in Monmouthshire have processes in place to ensure that all new community councillors receive such training, or to put it the other way, is it possible that we have new community councillors in Monmouthshire who've been there that sort of period, 1 year, 2 years, who've had no training whatsoever in the code, and in particular in social media usage? And the final issue of interest to me was that it also referenced the disrepute provision in the code, paragraph 6.1.a, which is the thing that's always on for all councillors. You must not behave in a way which could reasonably be regarded as bringing your office or authority into disrepute. And in paragraph 2.27, Councillor Baguli says, this is ambiguous as the word reasonably is subjective and open to interpretation. And that's one thing, probably the only thing in the report that I agree with, actually. I do think that the PSOW, the Ombudsman guidance on disrepute, does need to be better explained, particularly because it's a provision that's always on. Because if you start thinking anything I do could be disrepute, well, therefore, anything you do at any time could give you a breach of the code. And I did put that in a related comment in my feedback, Matt, when you sent out the stuff from the Ombudsman on the revisions of the Code of Conduct. So Those are my main comments. I also noticed that the PSOW guidance refers to the Welsh Local Government Association guide called Social Media, a Guide for Councillors. But if you look at that, it's all do's and don'ts of how to do this and that in Facebook and Twitter, and it doesn't contain any real hard examples. And I think this case is a really good hard example of, right, these are the postings. If you do this, you know, you face a real risk of being disqualified. And I think that's the thing that gets people's attention and keeps it very simple and shows you what the threshold is, what's acceptable, and in this case, what clearly isn't. So those were the reasons I put this forward, my thoughts, and I'd be very interested if you've got any comments or questions on this decision and on the issue of social media in general. No comments, no questions?
There was a phrase I read somewhere that if something is done knowingly, and that is an important phrase, if you're making a decision and you know something, whether you've got land or relations involved, it should be declared. It was that something is done knowingly. When you take a step forward, knowing that perhaps you shouldn't be.
Yes, thank you. Peter, you've got your hand up there.
Yes, one thing that puzzled me a little bit, and maybe Matt can clarify this, as I was reading through the report, I assumed that there would be an endpoint where the individual in question would be disqualified from membership of the community council. But reading some of the language in the report, and I think you've already quoted a little bit of it, which described the comments as being inflammatory and an expression of views which were extreme, threatening in nature, and promoted violence towards individuals. I think in other contexts, the prevent legislation would start to raise its head here. And I wondered if there was any issue for the county council, which would be the responsible body, to be reporting this in terms of prevent legislation. For me, the disqualification from the community council is kind of minor affair compared with what might be imposed on this individual through that legislation.
Thank you, Peter. Could you comment on that, Matt, please?
I shall try. The points that have been raised, so Richard, in terms of the confusion or the potential ambiguity about the use of the word reasonable, reasonably, and Irene used the word knowingly as well. Whenever I look at the code and whenever I deliver the training, this of the 15 kind of rules, if you like, before you get into interests, this is one of 3 which, like as you said, Richard, are always on. So with the other 12, the first question really that the Ombudsman needs to look at is, was that person acting as a councillor? But with this one and 2 of the others, and the other 2 really pertain to kind of appropriation of resources. So it'd be nigh on impossible to do that without having access to them as a councillor anyway. So really, for me, this is the only one that has the potential to always be on. And at the same time, it is the most far-reaching rule within the code of conduct. So that, I mean, you know, from the off, that makes this a devilishly difficult element of the code to deal with. And then the fact that you get into, you know, in classic legal terms, this is so much about the mens rea. What was that person thinking? What was their intent? So that's that point Irene made about knowingly. So often the test that's used, the reasonable person test is applied, which can tie you up in knots, actually, if you get too sucked into it. But in effect, it tries to make this an objective rather than subjective test. And it's the reasonable person, the man on the street, the individual on the Clapham omnibus, all those kind of different expressions are used. as to what would that person in the same context or faced, provided with the same information, what would they reasonably conclude? And that's really difficult for a court, or in this case a tribunal, to determine. And I'm dancing around the question a little bit here, because I find this element of the code the hardest one to deal with, because Peter's just made the point about the prevent legislation, and in terms of the language that is used here, which is in the wake of the Joe Cox murder and the nature of the fact that these were expressions of violence involving female politicians, is, I think, it's not unfair to represent the fact that that's not something that any reasonable society wants to see. But we have criminal laws that would take you into the space of, is this someone seeking to incite violence or not? Now, I would expect, on the nature of these posts, the community council to have engaged with the police from the outset, and then nothing would happen while there was any potential for a criminal investigation. And I would suspect, but I don't know this, so you have to take this with a considerable pinch of salt, that the police concluded that this kind of stuff goes on social media all the time, and sad to say, but getting into the Malicious Communications Act, or protection from harassment, or inciting to violence, is a really difficult thing for them to prove, because it goes back to this point about you've got to show what the intent of that individual is. So what's interesting for me with that case, so Peter, I would imagine in a case involving this, so if I was approached by the community council, I'd be advising them to engage with the police up front, because if there's going to be any criminal investigation, that needs to take precedence. You don't want the ombudsman involved in that point. You might let them know. You generally got about a year to go to the ombudsman with an issue anyway, but I'm sure they would take into account any delay because there was a criminal investigation. But in terms of police, if the police at that point don't want to get involved, or the community council as that sovereign entity don't want to make it a criminal matter, I'd be very reluctant to have a local authority step in and seek to try and police and refer this stuff, unless, if there was a link to a school or so, the context would vary. But in terms of this case, I'd be quite reluctant in wanting to see a local authority step into that space, because you're then asking that engagement with the police to happen at that level, and then you're then questioning the sovereignty of what the community council have chosen to do in the first place. You're questioning about whether the police should have taken a different action on the basis of it. So that's how I'd expect it to unfold. And this must have been as horrible as the phrasing and everything is. This would have been incredibly difficult for the tribunal, because, as I said, we see this stuff on social media all the time. So what we're seeing is the gap here between how the average person gets to act without being censored in any way by whatever the social media site might be. And we all know that doesn't happen very often. But the criminal test of, inciting hatred or malicious communications. And the ombudsman and thereafter the tribunal have got to be really careful as to how they tread this balance between criminal, what is it, not necessarily nice, but potentially acceptable behaviour, and policing effectively the minds and the intent of people within this code. So really difficult. And so some of the points that were raised, so it's probably worth just pointing out that I think the councillor is still has the ability to appeal on this. So this is not necessarily kind of set. If it was to go to the High Court as the next level of appeal, then we might come back and discuss this again in the future. And I would be very interested to see how a court, as opposed to a tribunal, approaches this. The training element, again, it's that balance piece, Richard. But for me, in how I conduct my role and work with the community councils, is about positive offering, but without getting to the point of seeking to kind of impose a regime, because again, it's about respecting the sovereignty of those entities. And if I can, the one other thing that jumped out at me So I don't know if anyone looked at the media coverage of this, but it seemed to me that one of the aggravating factors within the tribunal was the lack of remorse, the lack of contrition. Yet when you go to the media comments that are provided afterwards, there is clear remorse and contrition. You know, nobody who knows me would think in any way that I meant for anyone to commit a violent act. I'm not misogynistic, and those kind of comments. But I've learned my lesson, etc., etc. And it just made me wonder whether actually sometimes the greater power lies in media exposure than it does actually through the various constructs within which we have to work. But I'll leave that one with you.
Yes, thank you, Matt. Rian, you've got your hand up there. You're mute, I think. I can't hear you. Still can't hear you. We can't hear you. Yeah, sorry, I can't hear you at all. And just while waiting for Rian to fix things, then Matt, I take your point though about positive offerings, but that's also the online facility. If we got to the point where we could do regular, not quarterly, I don't know what, every code of conduct training on a rolling basis, and just keep the clerks aware of that so they can feed people in, or they can request these topics are the ones that are struggling with disrepute or interests or whatever. That would be one way of having a positive offering. It would be up to them to take it, but then at least it would be, if people miss out, it wouldn't be through a lack of an offer from us as the parent authority for standards.
If I can respond to that, Chair, one of the nuances of this space is it's very rare that a council wants to operate in terms of the training of this beyond their own council. I will get a couple come together from time to time, especially if there's lots of new members. But one of the benefits of the training comes from, within reason, councillors being able to speak to their own experience without going into cases, but speak to their own experience. As soon as you broaden that too far, the take up is just not there. So it's often done on a council by council basis.
Okay, thank you. Rian, are you with us now, sound wise? No. Sorry. I can't hear anything at all. Can you hear anything, Matt? It's not just me, is it? Here.
No, I can see that Rian has taken it off mute. It can be the case with this stuff that sometimes if you've got an additional monitor plugged in, it can affect how the microphone works, or if there's earphones plugged in as well. But judging by Rian's face, she's trying those things and is exasperated. There is the chat bar. One of us, if Rian wanted to put something in the chat bar, and then one of us were to read it out so that it's captured as part of the recording for the live stream, then that's a possibility.
Yeah, it's also interesting your point about the media coverage, Matt, of that, because I thought there was some interesting comments in the Wales Online article, which came out in January, which I think is before the full decision report was out, because it looked like the reporter couldn't get details of things. There must have been some summary announcement and nothing else. And there were also some quotes. You know, the report, the Wales Online report says the councillor confirmed he didn't cooperate with the Ombudsman's investigation, saying, quotes, "I just told them to get lost. I don't want anything to do with it. I want banning for life," unquote. So, you know, there's all sorts of things going on there, but that was before the full decision report was available. And a related point as well is that the criminal offences to do with online communications, I think there's a live Law Commission review as we speak, and they're looking at the old Act, which is the Malicious Communications Act, which is almost pre-internet, I think, and then the new one, the Communications Act, which is the 2003 section 127, and I think they're going to recommend some changes and to remove some of the sort of ambiguity, because there's been all sorts of decisions that have been queried both ways. You know, it's not working to pick up offensive content, and it's actually picking up things that were clearly a joke, for example. So that's going on now, and that's a live consultation. Do you have any communication from Rhian? Because I can't see the space, the bar.
I do, Chair. Yeah, so coming back on your, so there's two different Wales Online reports on this, one for the 5th of January, one from the 26th of January, I think. And I think you see the evolution between the situation and the knowledge in one into the other. I mean, this sits far beyond our humble standards committee, but the whole discussion around what is appropriate use of social media and discussion, and where do you go from free speech, how do you curtail it, is a considerable one. And yeah, it's difficult to know where that is going to take us, because there are already cases where, you know, you cited jokes being made where the Malicious Communications Act has been, again, in my own opinion, somewhat twisted to satisfy the need to take criminal action. But the question that Rhian has put in there is, why did the Adjudication Panel for Wales not report the issue to the police? I don't know the answer, but my guess would be the Adjudication Panel is a tribunal, so at that point it's hearing the matter. If there was to be any reference to the police, I would have expected it to come initially from the Community Council itself, and if not, then I suppose in the course of an investigation, the Ombudsman would. I don't know that they have a duty, but they always have the opportunity to involve the police if they think that they're investigating something that's of a criminal nature. So if it's going to happen, I would expect it to happen. And it may well have happened in this case. It wouldn't surprise me if it had. And Rhian's asked the question, the councillor said he was going to consider standing in May 2022. Would this be permitted? Well, it was a 15-month ban, I think. Yep. So if that started in January, yes, by my dodgy maths.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you, Rhian, for that question as well. That's it is a surprising thing. Why didn't they report it, or is that part of their remit? I don't know. Any further comments or questions on the APW report? Okay, I think we move on to the next item, which is to confirm the minutes of the previous meeting, well, our previous formal meeting, which was about a year ago. You know, 16th of March 2020. Yeah. You've all got a copy of the minutes. Are there any comments, or can I approve them?
Can we approve them, Chair?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Rhian. So those minutes are approved, and then we're on to the final item, which is to confirm the date of the next meeting for the 18th of October 2021, and I hope that will be back to face-to-face down in Usk. And unless there's any other AOB items, Matt, do you have anything else you want to?
Just in terms of the next meeting, I think I sent provisional dates for the standards conference around, but I'm being completely remiss and I can't remember the date. But I know that we'd want to sequence it so that, if possible, people would attend the standards conference, and then we would use the meeting after to feed back on it. So, without knowing at the moment exactly when that standards conference is going to happen, we may want to revisit that date and shift it by a couple of weeks. But clearly that's a matter for you and the committee as to whether we do that.
Okay, thank you. I do have a final point, which I'd like to say congratulations to Matt on his new role with the title Chief Officer People and Governance, which I saw sailed through full council the other day. You must have been relieved there was no opposition, Matt.
Thank you, Chair. It's still not something I've got particularly used to, having to go through job interviews and then changes of roles, relying on 43 good people to take a vote on it, rather than the way that people in other organisations might. But yeah, so just to explain that. So I'll remain the monitoring officer, so there'll be no change in terms of the interaction with the standards committee. It's just within the strategic leadership team within the organisation, all the members remaining the same. It's just the chief executives decided to kind of jiggle around some of the responsibilities. So I'll have the democratic services function come to me, which is pretty normal for a monitoring officer anyway. Well, the emergency planning, civil contingency work, predominantly be working within the coronavirus response for the last year anyway, and then the kind of HR elements as well. Hence the people. It's a tricky job trying to get a job title right so that you represent all the things that you do without having 14 different words in there. So people and governance is the best crack that we've had at it. So thank you very much.
Right, thank you. Anyone else? Any final questions or comments? No, done. Well, I'd like to thank you all for your contributions today and confirm, as it states, our next meeting, very much hope face-to-face on the 18th of October 2021. Thank you all.
Fine, thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.